China's economy has maintained a generally steady growth momentum so far this year, according to fresh official data. Have the doom and gloom headlines clouded the bright spots? And a recent cyber attack report has roiled China-Australia ties. But why, and what's the impact on the trading relationship between the two sides? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. China's economy has maintained a steady growth momentum from January to August, according to the latest economic data released on Monday by the Chinese government. But not everyone sees it that way, with various media outlets claiming China's economy is aching under stress and getting worse. What's causing such diverging analysis and predictions? What's the big picture, both domestically and internationally? Joining me for the discussion from Boston, the U.S. is Professor Ravi Ramamurti, Director of the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University, and here in the studio, Zhao, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, according to Fu Linghui, the spokesperson of the National Bureau of Statistics, on Monday, generally speaking, the economy has maintained a steady growth momentum from January to August, and in Chinese, the exact words are the major indices, some rose, some dropped. Industrial output relatively slowed, but the increase in service sector picked up. Sales maintained a steady growth, and investment slightly slowing down in terms of growth. So, Mr. Zhao, paint us the big picture first. How do you look at the big picture of China's economy, given all the indices, all the different sectors and different trends that I just painted?
Well, first of all, from January to August, for the first 3 quarters of this year, relatively speaking, China's economic growth maintained certain speed, slightly above 6%, reaching pretty much the target set by the government from the beginning of the year. Meaning that even though within and without China there are all kinds of pressure on the economy, still downward pressure, China's economy weathered this pressure quite well, and so far the economic growth maintained steady and stable at this stage. And if you look at the numbers, there are certain areas that show weakness, for instance, industrial output and investment overall. However, there are also a bright spot, including overall consumption, aggregated consumption, and also in some areas, particularly high-tech growth, still maintain a very high speed. So overall speaking, we can see that the transition towards a high-quality economic growth maintained its momentum, and so far as we can see, that even though under this great pressure in terms of external and internal pressure, China's transition continue on.
The value-added industrial output, which is one of the indices the most widely quoted by international media, let's take a look at that indices, and that grew 4.4% in August year-on-year. For July, it was 4.8%, and many international media is using this as a basis to say that the economy is sluggish or not doing as well as expected, and Reuters also said that the growth in industrial production is at its weakest in 17.5 years. So, Professor Ramamurti, how do you look at the importance of this indices and how much it is representing the true state of health of the Chinese economy?
Well, I think we have two trends, one overlaid on the other. The first trend is a long-term trend in which China's growth is coming down over a period of time, mainly because the labor force has peaked. And so this is something that was expected to happen. You can't grow at 10% forever. At some point, the growth will begin to slow down, and usually that happens when the supply of labor begins to peak. So all of the people who moved from the farm to the factory to boost China's GDP, that phase is over, so you were expecting a growth to slow down anyhow. On top of that, now we've had the trade war with the U.S., and that is of course dampening the exports of manufactured products from China to the US. And when you put these two things together, you see a further slowing down, which is to be expected. And the challenge for China is how to reorient the economy so it is more driven by domestic consumption. This has been going on for a few years, and I think you're seeing some signs that that is starting to take effect. But I think a slowdown in the industrial output is not surprising because most of the exports tend to be industrial products.
Now, let's also must keep in mind the international big picture, right, against which China is trying to develop its economy. For instance, for the first half of this year, China achieved 6.3% growth. What kind of level of growth is that compared to what we're seeing in other parts of the world? Zhao.
Well, if you look at the IMF and World Bank international global economy forecast, they're lowering their global targets. The World Bank lowered that during the summer to 2.6 this year and 2.7 next year, and also IMF lowered to 3.2 and 3.5 this year and next year. So overall, you can see that under the threat of trade war and other factors, the global economy is slowly getting much slower. In Europe, the economy is quite weak, with Germany's economy actually in the negative territory. And also, let's take a look at India, for instance. India's economy used to grow even faster than China, and now they're growing at a 7-year low. So I think overall, the picture globally is slowing down, and within that context, China is slowing down, particularly this month. If you look at the number, it's understandable. And also, a single month's data cannot represent the whole year, and there are twists and turns, I think, in this trade war and also the overall trading picture. So I think we have to pay attention, as the professor pointed out, for the long-term factors played in this long.
Yeah, Professor Ramamurti, what is your assessment of the overall environment of economic development and the factor of that in China's growth numbers?
Well, there is feedback here. I mean, China slows down because the rest of the world slows down. The rest of the world slows down because China slows down. So you get these negative feedback effects, and I think that is also playing out. As your guest mentioned, many of the other economies in the world are also slowing down. India has slowed down. Germany is in recession, and you're seeing Korea is growing at maybe 1%. So many of the countries that export into China are slowing down because China's growth and exports are slowing down. So this is part of the sort of the downside of globalization, which is we're all interconnected, and when something slows down in one part of the world, it tends to have ripple effects in other parts of the world. So in that context, a 6% growth rate is still a very respectable growth rate.
China set at the beginning of this year a growth target between 6 to 6.5%. For the first half of this year, China realized 6.3%. Now, the big question is whether China is going to continue that momentum, so to keep the growth rate within that window of half a percentage point of fluctuation. Zhao, given the trend that we're seeing, and then we have a rather long holiday season coming up and just a few months to go, although the job creation number is very good, but overall, do you think China is on track to stay within that very important window of 6 to 6.5% growth rate for the year of 2019?
I think, first of all, the government set the range because they understood that from the beginning of the year, there are many factors affecting economic growth. Therefore, there's a lot of uncertainty, and in many areas, particularly in terms of investment, affected by this global trade war and also all kinds of protectionism. So that's why I think the government is quite cautious about setting these goals. However, I think the government also has a lot of tools in their toolbox to weather this downward pressure and to basically manage the economy to reach that target. So for me, I'm confident that by the end of the year, they can reach the basic target at least above 6%. However, I think in the medium to long run, the government is still under pressure to maintain a successful transition toward this so-called high-quality economic growth.
Are we seeing signs, though, that the structural reform is still ongoing and that we are seeing a limited level of success, at least by now? Because from the numbers that I'm seeing in August, for instance, the high-tech manufacturing is outperforming the overall industrial output by 1.7% with a 6.1% year-on-year increase. And also domestic consumption is also ever more robust, and it's driving the economy. For instance, as I can tell, in August, retail sales of consumer goods, excluding automobiles, rose 9.3% year-on-year. So are we seeing the right signs at this moment, at least, Zhao?
I think the government took two categories of steps. First one is counter-cyclical measures, basically countering this downward trend. And secondly, the stimulus measures, trying to stimulate the economy by reducing taxes and reducing tariffs. So overall, in the latter half of this year, you can see that the effects of these tools have been gradually emerging, and the numbers in August shows that the consumption continued to pick up, and overall the high-tech sector has been stimulated by government policies, particularly tax cut. So I think this trend will continue.
Now let's take a little bit a look at the result of the latest survey by the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. According to the 2019 China Business Report, over half of U.S. companies operating in China say that they are either delaying or reducing investment as a direct result of China-U.S. trade tensions, with only 4.5% increasing their investment in China in response. So, Professor Ramamurti, as we stretch further into this trade war, do you foresee that more and more companies will be making up their mind about what to do next, and that option looks more and more like moving outside of China to somewhere else, for instance, in Southeast Asia?
Right. I think that is almost certain to happen. I think for the moment they're waiting to see whether the trade war is a passing phase or a long-term trend, and I think the jury is still out on that. So they're delaying their decisions on where to make products, and whether to make it in China or one of the other countries close to China. But I think it's fair to expect that more companies will think about shifting final assembly out of China to one of the other countries. So then the product would be considered made in Vietnam or made in Thailand rather than made in China, and that will take some of the pressure off of the U.S.-China trade imbalance. But a lot of the back-end production of imports might still come out of China. After all, this is what happened in China in the last 20 or 30 years, as companies moved assembly to China, and progressively parts and components also began to be made in China. So we may see this. Again, this is, I think, as a long-term trend which is likely to happen anyhow, but it might get speeded up because of the trade conflict with the U.S.
Yeah, how much pressure is that going to put for China to reach its 6.0% GDP target bottom line? Professor Ramamurti.
Yeah, well, I think it does increase the pressure to do that. But let's not forget that, trade is becoming a less and less important piece of the total GDP for China over the last 10 or 15 years. And the trade with the U.S., while it's substantial, the value added in that trade is maybe 3% of China's GDP. So, if you take a one-time hit and shift some of that value added to other parts of Asia, there could still be substantial opportunities for value adding within China of components and parts that used to make final products.
Okay, and I understand the overall domestic consumption from China is making up the great majority of China's GDP. If I remember correctly, the number is like 70% as of August. So there, Professor Ramamurti makes a very good point. We have to leave it there. Many thanks to Zhao, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Professor Ravi Ramamurti, Director of the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University in Boston.